Mirna Salihin had distanced herself from her friend Jessica Wongso after an awkward conversation. But when she decided to meet up with a group of friends, including Jessica, tragedy would strike and Indonesia's trial of the century would follow. I'm Charlie and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to Crime Lines and welcome back if you've listened before. This case that we're going to talk about today was one that I planned on covering over on Patreon in September. And when I was done writing it, I did what I usually do, and I do a Google search for news that had occurred within the last 90 days up to a year. That's because when you're researching these cases, they get a ton of reporting when they happen, so that is at the top of the Google results. To get those little updates that might be newer, you have to kind of restrict your search. Just a little peek behind the curtain of my process. Well, when I did that, literally after I had this fully written, I saw that Netflix was releasing a documentary called Ice Cold that came out in late September about this case. So I went ahead and held on to the script until I watched the documentary. And I had some thoughts on the documentary, so I thought I would go ahead and put this out on the main feed and encourage you all to go watch the documentary, listen to my episode, and then go on the Facebook page or Twitter account for Crime Lines, and we can kind of discuss what you got out of the documentary versus what you got out of my episode and where they mesh and where they conflict a bit. So let's go ahead and get started. This case takes place in Jakarta, which is the capital and largest city in Indonesia. That's where Wayan Mirna Salihin, who went by Mirna, grew up. Mirna's father, Eddie, was a wealthy businessman, and she attended one of the top international schools in Jakarta. As such, she finished school fully fluent in English and went to Sydney, Australia for college to study design. This was obviously a big move for Mirna, who came from a tight-knit family, which included her twin sister. And Mirna's boyfriend, Arif, also went to Australia for school, but he went to Melbourne, which is about a 9-hour drive from Sydney. So it wasn't like they were going to be able to see each other frequently. But Mirna was not without friends for long wherever she went because she was outgoing, she was funny, and she was a lot of fun to be around. At school, Mirna met another Indonesian student named Jessica Wongso, and the two were fast friends. They had a lot in common, having both grown up in Jakarta in wealthy families. A lot of their life experiences were similar. Jessica's father owned a business that had significant interests in Australia, so the family moved there in 2005, but Jessica would stay behind in Jakarta to finish school before joining our family in Australia, and that's where she would study graphic design. Jessica then introduced Mirna to two more friends, Hani and Vera, and the four became inseparable. They studied together, went out together, and hardly went a day without seeing each other. Of course, as happens with these close, intense college friendships, they sometimes drift with distance when everyone graduates. After graduation, Mirna went back to Jakarta with her boyfriend Arif, as did Vera and Hani. Jessica, however, stayed in Sydney since her family was there, and she became a permanent resident in Australia and started working full-time in her field. Mirna, back in Jakarta, didn't have necessarily the same career aspirations as Jessica. Planning a future with Arif, she was hopeful her life would soon be dominated by motherhood, though she talked about working on a business idea that was more about her hobbies than her training. She wanted to open a coffee shop. Mirna was very much into coffee. I really like coffee, but I'll drink swill. I don't really care. And if you start talking about the notes and the flavors of the coffee, you've lost me. But Mirna was a coffee person in that she did notice and care about those things. She accepted the label of coffee snob, and she thought she could bring that attention to a cafe. And she was right on trend. Coffee consumption in Indonesia had been on a sharp rise for years, and it would just keep on going up. When Mirna and Arif were ready to start a family in November of 2015, they went to Bali for an extravagant wedding. She invited many people from all phases of her life, including her college friends Hani and Vera, but she did not invite Jessica. The two had a bit of a tense visit just 5 months before Mirna's wedding. Mirna was in Sydney for vacation, and she reached out to Jessica so that they could get together. Jessica hadn't been back to Indonesia in probably 3 or 4 years at that point, so they had been keeping up mostly just online and through texting. So the two made plans to have dinner together. At dinner, Mirna asked Jessica if she was seeing anyone, and Jessica told her about her boyfriend, an Australian man named Patrick. Whatever Jessica said about Patrick did not impress Mirna at all. In fact, it bothered her. Though Mirna very likely did not know it, Jessica was suffering from severe depression at the time and possible alcohol abuse, so she wasn't really a reliable narrator. She was seeing things through a very rough filter, and she was basically complaining about Patrick to Mirna. Mirna, never one to shy away from a strong opinion, advised Jessica to just break things off with Patrick. She was convinced he must be on drugs or something based on what Jessica was saying, but regardless of the reason, he wasn't treating Jessica well, and for her own good, she needed to find someone else. Mirna apparently delivered this opinion in a bit of a monologue and without mincing words. When she wrapped up what she wanted to say on the matter, Jessica stood up and walked out without saying a word. After Mirna told Arif that it was for the best that she and Jessica not really see each other one-on-one in the future. It was just too tense between them after this. Mirna returned to Jakarta, and to her, it made sense to go ahead and exclude Jessica from the final wedding guest list because they were not speaking. And with Jessica in Sydney, I imagine the two thought that after that dinner, they would never have to see each other again. There just really wouldn't be the chance. But then Jessica moved back to Jakarta rather abruptly in late 2015. Things in Sydney for Jessica were not going well over the course of that year. Walking out on a dinner with an old college friend was the least of what Jessica was dealing with. For one thing, the police were called to her apartment 3 times that year due to her either talking about suicide or attempting it. In early 2015, Jessica told Patrick she was going to kill herself with a knife. In October, she took a small grill into her room and lit it, trying to fill up the space with smoke. Patrick had to call for help for that as well. And then a couple weeks later, the police were called again and found Jessica more or less passed out from the overconsumption of alcohol. There were notes near her, which were essentially suicide notes, blaming Patrick for leaving her and her family for ignoring her. In the midst of all of that, Jessica had also been arrested for a DUI, and it was bad. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and Jessica lost control of her car. She drove into a nursing home. Jessica's injuries were relatively minor, and no one else was injured, but that was just a luck, because she very well could have plowed into the nearby bedrooms. Thankfully, she didn't. She was charged, obviously, so on top of her depression and her existing drinking issues, she was now dealing with the legal system and the embarrassment of the local news stations reporting on this crash. Then, in late November, Patrick went to the police to file for a restraining order. He wrote that Jessica was harassing him, she was harassing his family and his friends, and the behavior, which had initially just been unwanted phone calls and texts, had escalated into vandalism, according to Patrick. Though there was not enough evidence to charge Jessica with any crime, the restraining order was granted. And then Jessica was fired from her job. Her boss had been keeping an eye on her after the DUI, particularly as it didn't seem like Jessica felt sorry about it at all. She could have killed someone, and she did not seem all that bothered. This boss noticed what Patrick had seen. At times, Jessica could be charismatic and warm, but then she would quickly turn moody and angry. Eventually, the moody side took over far too often, and one time when the boss went to visit Jessica while she was hospitalized in the psychiatric unit, Jessica made a comment that could be seen as a death threat. Her employment was terminated not long after that. So now Jessica was in Australia with no boyfriend, no job, and a looming court date for the DUI. She decided her best option was to return to Jakarta, telling people that she quit her job in Australia for better opportunities in Indonesia. But Jessica would also characterize this return to Jakarta as just a long vacation, so it's not really clear if she intended to stay or not, or if she even knew what she wanted to do next. The day before Jessica flew back to Indonesia, she started a group chat to connect her college friends who were all in Jakarta: Mirna, Hani, and Vera. She messaged them on December 5th, and Mirna took a few days to reply. Jessica was trying to set up a time they could get together, and eventually Mirna agreed to go out to dinner with her, but not wanting to be alone with Jessica after how poorly their last meal together went, she brought her husband Arif with her. Dinner went well enough, so when Jessica suggested the four women all go out for drinks, Mirna agreed. They set January 6th, 2016 as the date, and Jessica picked the location, Olivier, which was a high-end cafe and restaurant in the Grand Indonesian shopping mall. Jessica offered to treat them to whatever they wanted, so in these messages, they were basically putting in drink orders, and Mirna said she loved their Vietnamese iced coffee, which is essentially a pour-over iced coffee with condensed milk. The meeting time they set up was a bit fluid. First, it was sometime after 4. Then it was pushed out to more like 5, with Vera not being able to be there until 6 when she got off of work. This was a casual thing, so no one seemed to really feel pressure to lock down a time. When Mirna and Hani arrived at the restaurant together around 5:15, Jessica was already at the table with their drinks. Cocktails for her and Hani and the coffee Mirna had mentioned. They did the usual hellos and such before they sat down. Mirna then took a big gulp of her coffee through the straw and said it tasted terrible. She asked her friends to try it. The whole, "this tastes gross, try it" thing we tend to do. Her friend Hani was not about to take a sip of something disgusting, so she just stuck her straw in the coffee and pulled it out, only tasting a little bit at the end of the straw. Jessica turned down the offer to try the coffee completely. The taste of the coffee became the discussion point for the next minute or so as Mirna was trying to work out what was wrong with it. Then suddenly, Mirna waved her hand in front of her face, threw her head back, and began to have what appeared to be a seizure. When her body relaxed, she collapsed. Hani jumped up and tried to get Mirna to come to as the cafe staff called for help. Paramedics arrived quickly and rushed her off to the hospital. Hani called Mirna's husband Arif and told him what happened. She told him what hospital she was heading to, while Jessica was asking the manager of the restaurant what was in the coffee. Mirna was fine. She took a sip of the coffee that tasted terrible and then suddenly had a seizure and collapsed. The coffee seemed like it might be the catalyst, though the manager could not imagine how. To the staff, it looked like Mirna had an epileptic seizure, a medical emergency, not triggered by a sip of coffee. But with Jessica being so insistent to know what was wrong with the coffee, the manager took a small sip and said it tasted rotten. She asked the barista what happened, and he looked at it, noticing that instead of being the rich golden color of a Vietnamese coffee, it was more orange-yellow. In the documentary Ice Cold, he likened it to the color of turmeric. He said it also smelled bad, though he did not taste it. He went through all of the ingredients in the back, and nothing looked off. They had served 10 cups of Vietnamese iced coffee that day, and no one else had complained about their coffee, so he had no idea what had happened. Given that the coffee seemed off, they decided to hold on to the cup. They wrapped the cup with the coffee still in it in saran wrap and set it to the side. At some point, the police came and collected it, as this became a suspicious death investigation when Mirna died on the way to the hospital. Though they tried to resuscitate her, she was pronounced dead at the age of 27. Her family gathered at the hospital and were so distraught and in denial. Her father said he tried to breathe into her mouth to revive her, and her twin sister smacked Mirna's cheeks, begging her to wake up. While still at the hospital, several of Mirna's friends gathered, including Hani and Jessica. Eddie, Mirna's father, was trying to figure out what happened, so he asked them questions. He learned that she had convulsed shortly after drinking her coffee, so he asked Jessica what she had to drink. She said a mineral water, which was an odd thing for her to have said since there were no mineral waters ordered. The 3 drinks for the table were a Sazerac, an old-fashioned, and a Vietnamese iced coffee. After they had time with Mirna at the hospital, the family was advised that she would be transported to a funeral home, so they headed over there to make the arrangements. And while they were there, the police came to them and said they believed the manner of death was suspicious based on what was said at the cafe. Mirna was fine. She took a sip of coffee and then died. She may have been poisoned. To find out what happened to Mirna, the police wanted permission to do a full autopsy. Mirna's mother, Santi, refused. Due to the religious and cultural norms in Indonesia, autopsies are not generally done unless it's a criminal investigation, and even then they will try to get the family's permission to avoid a family formally objecting. Since this case wasn't a clear murder investigation, but more just a suspicion, they hoped they would be able to get permission. Over the next couple of days, the police spoke with the family more at length about the process. In the end, there was a bit of a compromise reached. The family would allow the investigators to take blood, tissue, and stomach samples from the body, but they would not cut Mirna open, so no examination of her brain, heart, or lungs. With this agreement in place, the medical examiner did find bleeding and irritation in Mirna's stomach and intestines. It was determined that came from ingesting a corrosive substance. There was also a blackening on the inside of Mirna's mouth, and additional toxicology tests determined there was a small amount of cyanide in her system. That finding was rather surprising because there was a previous tox screen done on Mirna's stomach contents at the hospital shortly after her death, and they had not found cyanide in that. So one of the tests was wrong, and the police believed it was the first one, and that's in part because they had the lab results back from the coffee. And the coffee came back positive for cyanide, a lot of cyanide. Since Mirna's symptoms lined up with an ingestion of a significant amount of cyanide, that was ruled the cause of death. So, how did the cyanide get into the coffee? To figure that out, the investigators pulled CCTV footage from the restaurant to see if anyone, whether the person who made the coffee, the server who dropped it off at the table, or anyone at the table had the opportunity to slip the cyanide into the coffee. They watched as Jessica arrived at the cafe first around 3:30 in the afternoon. She was there for just a minute, she looked around, and then left. 45 minutes later, she came back to the restaurant, and this time she had 3 large shopping bags with her. This was 4:14 p.m. according to the many security cameras at the restaurant. After sitting at a table, Jessica looked directly at one of the security cameras. She then picked up her shopping bags and arranged them on the table in a way that blocked the camera from seeing all of her. Jessica sat for a few minutes before going to the counter to order the drinks. They rang up at 4:18 and were dropped off at the table at 4:24, so 36 minutes before her friends were supposed to be there. So that was a little suspicious on its own, because why order the drinks so early? The iced coffee would end up watered down as the ice melted, and the cocktails would be room temperature by the time the friends got there. And since Mirna and Hani were 10 minutes late, Jessica was at the table for more like 45 minutes with the drinks. At no point in time did anyone else approach the table or interfere with the drinks. However, the cameras didn't catch Jessica doing anything either, because when the server brought the drinks over to the table, she put all 3 of them behind that bag wall she had made, which blocked them from the view of the camera. Even to the cafe staff, the bags on the table seemed odd because she was sitting in a large booth, and she had room for them on the seat next to her, which is where most people would have put their bags. From what the camera could pick up of Jessica, the police saw her moving quite a bit in this time. About 5 minutes after the drinks were dropped off, she opened her handbag while she looked to the left and then to the right. Why was she opening her bag looking around rather than looking at the bag? She then changed seats at least twice, and she seemed to be fiddling with something behind the bags. She was moving like you would if you were, say, adding something to a coffee cup and then stirring it, or at least that's how the police saw it. The way the Vietnamese iced coffee was served is relevant here. They would put the condensed milk and ice in a cup, and then on top of the cup would be the pour-over filter with the coffee grounds. And then they would pour the water in and serve it with the filter still on. The customer would then wait for it to finish dripping and then remove the filter, let their coffee chill, and then drink it. So this wasn't an open cup of coffee. If you were going to add something to this coffee, you would need to remove the filter layer first, add whatever you wanted, stir, and then put the filter back on. Now, while they could not see Jessica doing these exact things since the cup was blocked from view, her movements did make them wonder. Jessica could also be seen moving her hands from a bag to the center of the table, which is where the coffee would have been located. So why was she moving or touching someone else's drink? The investigators kept watching as Mirna arrived, sipped her coffee, and then convulsed. Hani was seen reacting quickly, coming right to Mirna's aid, while Jessica just stood there. Whether she was frozen in shock or in indifference, we can't really tell from security footage. But what we do know is that Jessica was now the top suspect in the case. But it turned out that Mirna's family had already suspected it before the CCTV cameras were even checked. At Mirna's funeral, Jessica even left early because a family member confronted her about her possible involvement. Their suspicions started pretty much right away at the hospital. Hani at the hospital was distraught. Not only had her friend died, it all happened right in front of her. Jessica was, according to Mirna's dad and according to Hani, the complete opposite. She was completely calm. Right or wrong, they were comparing the two women's reactions, and it just didn't make sense to them. Then, after Mirna's death, Jessica reached out to Mirna's twin sister, Sandy. Well, reaching out might be overstating it a bit. She forwarded Sandy an article about toxic Vietnamese coffee, basically suggesting to the family that maybe the coffee was bad and that this was not anyone's doing. The toxic coffee that she was referring to is called battery coffee, and it's called that because it's battery powder that they mix in with low-quality coffee. The purpose is to give the coffee a dark color so that it looks dark and rich when it is anything but. However, this has only been identified as an issue in Vietnam, and they have shut down coffee roasters and packagers who are caught doing this. Having a Vietnamese iced coffee prepared at a high-end cafe in Jakarta is just not the same thing. Vietnamese iced coffee describes more the process anyway than the origins of the coffee bean. Also, while battery coffee is toxic and I do not recommend anyone drink it, it is not immediately deadly. You won't drink one sip of it and experience what Mirna did. Now, I sound like I'm defending the coffee a bit, which would be on brand for me, but what I'm really saying is that the information Jessica was giving was irrelevant in this case, and it seemed like a strange thing for her to have emailed Mirna's sister. And to then add to their suspicions, Arif also told Mirna's family that after that awkward dinner in Sydney several months before, Mirna told him she was not comfortable with Jessica. Something was just off with her, and she didn't want to be with her alone. That's why he went to the dinner in Jakarta, and that's why Mirna arrived for the coffee date with Hani, to avoid being alone with Jessica. But those are all just suspicions. And when we look at this case as motive, means, and opportunity, the police only had one of those at this point, the opportunity. Jessica had the coffee in front of her longer than anyone else. So now let's talk about the means. Did Jessica have access to cyanide? And the answer was maybe. Jessica was not searched at the mall that day. After all, this was a medical emergency as far as anyone knew, not a murder. So if she had a packet or cyanide traces in her pockets, they didn't know. And she had, soon after the murder, told her maid to throw away the pants she was wearing. Her mother claimed it was because there was a tear in them, but what it means is that by the time the police circled around to test them for residue, they were long gone. What the police did have was the CCTV footage of Jessica as Mirna was getting first aid from the staff. She was seen scratching her hands as though they itched. Cyanide is an irritant to the skin and it can cause contact dermatitis, which would itch. However, I did not see any report of anyone noticing a rash on Jessica's hands that day. Now, it would help their case a lot if they could figure out how or where Jessica got cyanide, and pretty much everyone on the internet did try to figure that out. This case had exploded in the media, including social media. To buy cyanide in Indonesia, you need to provide a reason why you need it, and the sale is documented. The reason generally has to be for scientific research or industrial purposes. Neither Jessica nor anyone connected to her had bought any as far as the investigators could tell. There was some speculation that she could have gotten it from a fishing village. Some small fishing operations would still use cyanide in their fishing, even though it was outlawed. The cyanide in the water won't kill the fish, but it does slow them down to make them easier to catch. Jessica wasn't really known for hanging out in fishing villages, but if a small fishing operation could manage to get the poison, surely a resourceful woman with access to wealth could have gotten it. She had also been living in Australia until just a month before Mirna's poisoning. Australia does require a permit to buy cyanide, though just like in Indonesia, that doesn't mean she couldn't have gotten it somehow. In 2011, a man in Sydney managed to order some off the internet and have it delivered right to his residential address. So while they couldn't figure out where Jessica got the cyanide, claims that she couldn't have gotten it due to the laws, both in Indonesia and Australia, fell flat because people with a lesser means do manage to get their hands on it. So now we have clear-cut opportunity and circumstantial, maybe possible means that could apply to pretty much anyone. But let's go ahead and move on to the motive. This case had blown up in the media, so separating the wheat from the chaff when it comes to dealing with tips was a tricky job. A lot of people had heard a rumor about one motive or the other. One that came up a few times involved Mirna's husband, Arif. In one version, he paid someone at the restaurant to slip the cyanide into Mirna's drink to cash in on her life insurance policy. Obviously, that didn't make a lot of sense because Mirna didn't order her own drink. Jessica did. Mirna didn't even show up until 45 minutes after the drink was served to the table. So the only way they would have known which of the 3 drinks was Mirna's was if Jessica told them, and that would have implicated Jessica in the plot. The person who made the drink that day obviously denied any accusations against him, and Mirna's family also spoke up in defense of Arif. But that was not the only theory involving Arif. The other was that Jessica had a relationship with him when they were students in Australia, and this was a love triangle. When Jessica found out that he and Mirna were married, she killed Mirna out of jealousy. This theory started with a crumb of information. Jessica had allegedly told a coworker that she had a friend who was marrying her ex-boyfriend. Now, first of all, we don't even know if she said this, that she meant Arif and Mirna, as Jessica was in her mid to late 20s at that point, and probably had a few ex-boyfriends. And if she did mean Mirna and Arif, she was probably just lying. Arif and Jessica didn't meet until after he was already dating Mirna, and they only saw each other in person a few times because he was studying down in Melbourne. They never saw each other without Mirna there. Jessica was just one of his girlfriend's friends. This was a tiny morsel of hearsay information that was turned into accusations that this was some weird love triangle. But that wasn't the only jealousy theory proposed based on a small piece of information. The other one was that Jessica didn't want Mirna's husband, but rather she wanted Mirna. The information that led to this speculation was that Mirna's father had found some WhatsApp messages from Jessica that could be interpreted as intimate in nature, including one that said, "I want to kiss you, it's been a long time." Mirna's family said the messages were incoming only. Mirna did not reciprocate, and they did not believe she ever had any type of romantic relationship with Jessica, even if Jessica wanted one. But the truth is that Jessica's messages could also be read as someone just missing a deep and emotionally intimate friendship, while Mirna had been distancing herself from it. So Jessica may have been dealing with unrequited love, but it may have been platonic. In the end, the police were leaning towards a motive of jealousy, but not a love triangle, not some unrequited love, not anything romantic. The theory was that Mirna had this amazing life that Jessica wanted. She didn't want Arif or Mirna specifically, but she wanted a stable life with a partner who wasn't calling the police on her. Jessica was depressed, she had been fired from her job, and then she went to Jakarta only to learn that Mirna had gotten married without inviting her. And the two friends Jessica had introduced Mirna to years before, they were invited. As Mirna and Jessica caught up over dinner in December, she heard how Mirna and Arif had that storybook wedding in Bali and were planning a family, things Jessica wanted. She seethed over her jealousy until she decided the only way to end it was to kill Mirna. Then she would have no life, let alone one that was better than Jessica's. And when the police learned about Jessica's long year of problems in Australia, including her ex-boyfriend getting a restraining order against her, they believed Jessica's emotional instability could absolutely have led to violence. The provocation of Mirna simply not wanting to be close friends anymore would have been enough, given Jessica's state of mind. On January 29th, about 3 weeks after Mirna died, the police showed up at the home Jessica was staying at, and they were told by her family she wasn't there. The police then tracked her down, which they did the next morning, and she was arrested on January 30th, 2016, at a hotel that she checked into without telling anyone. According to Jessica, she went to the hotel because the media had swarmed her house. But Mirna's family believed she was there with her luggage as she prepared to flee the country. Jessica denied involvement in Mirna's death both to the police and publicly to the media, and her family hired her a top-notch attorney. As the case moved towards trial, the media only ramped up their reporting. This was equated to the O.J. Simpson trial in the United States. It was called Indonesia's trial of the century. One thing that really captured the public's attention was how Jessica appeared on camera. She became known as the smiling prisoner and the smiling killer because she was caught smiling on camera so often. When one reporter called out, "Did you put cyanide in the coffee?" Jessica didn't just smile, but she laughed. Maybe she was doing this out of nervousness or awkwardness, but it was easy to read it as her enjoying the attention. Another thing that received significant press was a deal Indonesia made with Australia. Australia agreed to help with the investigation in their country. They would look into if there was any way Jessica could have gotten the cyanide, what her behavior was like before she went back to Jakarta, and they would interview witnesses and so on. However, they would only do so if Indonesia did not pursue the death penalty in the case. Australia had outlawed the death penalty in 1985, and they actively opposed its use anywhere in the world. But they had recently fumbled that a bit when they helped investigate a drug smuggling network, and their work directly led to the conviction of 2 Australians who were then executed by firing squad in Indonesia. So Australia was very clear at this point that they would not be making that mistake again. If they helped Indonesia with an investigation, the death penalty had to be off the table. Indonesians in favor of the death penalty, including members of Mirna's family, were upset that the Indonesian government would let another country dictate the punishment of an Indonesian murderer who killed an Indonesian woman in Indonesia. But they made the deal, and that meant that all of Jessica's trials and tribulations in Australia were part of the case, but she would not be facing the death penalty. And I do think the information from Australia was pretty important here because the motive of jealousy over Mirna's happy life seemed pretty weak and incredibly speculative without any of the added context of Jessica's own life and struggles. The prosecution also bolstered their case for motive with the results of Jessica's psychological evaluation. She was diagnosed with a narcissistic personality with the subtype of, quote, amorous narcissist. I had to look up amorous narcissist because I'd never heard of this. And according to psychologist Dr. George Simon, amorous narcissists are often less abrasive than most narcissists come off as. They lean way more on the charming side of things and less on the grandiose bragging or obvious ego. The relationships they have, like most narcissistic relationships, are transactional. Scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, only they're going to scratch your back 20%, but expect you to scratch theirs 100%. Once they get all they can have from you, they move on. Except if you are done before they are and they cannot handle that blow to their ego. Because at the end of the day, even if amorous narcissists are more pleasant to have around, they're still narcissists. They have an inflated ego, and any blow to that ego will not be taken well. According to those evaluating Jessica, this is seen in her reactions to Patrick breaking up with her threats of suicide, and then essentially stalking him. And let's add to that she had a friend who had very strong opinions against the relationship she wanted to be in, only for Mirna to have been proven right when Patrick broke up with Jessica and got the restraining order. That would have been a big blow. Then let's add in Mirna's happy marriage, and this was a full-scale attack on Jessica's ego, at least from her point of view. Even the method of murder matched with this personality type. They are less aggressive and in your face. They're sneakier, using subtle manipulation and gaslighting to get their way. Jessica would never have shown up with a knife or a gun, but a poisoning, that tracks with this personality type. So when this case went to trial in mid-June 2016, all of this came into play. The stuff from Australia, like the suicide attempts, the restraining order, and the drunk driving crash into a nursing home. And the media went wild with this information. If Jessica was some poor girl from a village no one heard of, that would have been one thing. But she was the daughter of a wealthy plastics importer in Jakarta. The rich are not supposed to have these types of problems, and it can be a bit of a spectacle when they do. But as usual, the one thing wealthy people in trouble with the law can do is hire good legal representation, which is what Jessica did. She hired Otto Hasabun, who is a bit of a celebrity attorney. He initially hesitated to take the case, according to what he told the documentary Ice Cold. While high-profile cases can raise one's own profile, he didn't really need this case to do that. And it would be a blow to his reputation if he tried to convince the judges of the innocence of a guilty person. Otto told Jessica that he would take her case if she agreed to let him resign from it if he found any evidence of her guilt. She said she was innocent and he wouldn't find out otherwise, so she agreed to the terms. In the Indonesian court system, there is no jury. Rather, it is a panel of 3 judges, and it's an adversarial system like we have here in the U.S. The prosecution team and the defense team went head-to-head. The prosecution presented the evidence that we've gone over already with the coffee with the cyanide in it and the CCTV of Jessica with the bags. They also had psychologists testify that Jessica was essentially emotionally unstable and compulsive. All of this is what we often hear in court, but they did have a different sort of expert testify. This one testified that he knew Jessica had a bad character due to the shape of her nose and the lack of sparkle in her eyes, which are beyond outdated methods of assessing anyone. The judges asked what information he used to understand this eye sparkle assessment, and he said he used empirical studies that were based on Hollywood stars, and he pointed out Julia Roberts as someone with sparkle in her eyes. It was surprising to me that any court would allow this as evidence, period. But as soon as he was comparing the eye sparkle of someone like Jessica Wongso, who had very dark eyes, to the hazel eyes of Julia Roberts, surely someone would have thought maybe the reflection of light had something to do with this incredibly subjective assessment. Of course, the defense attacked the prosecution's case on this point as well as many others, pointing out that there was no real motive and no direct evidence. And the lack of a strong motive was something the prosecution knew they had to contend with. As with any case, the motive lies with the killer, and if they don't tell you what the motive was, you just have to piece it together with the evidence you have. Just like in the U.S., the prosecution in Indonesia does not have to prove motive, but it sure is nice when they can. As for the lack of direct evidence, no one saw Jessica put the cyanide in the coffee, and no one could prove she even had cyanide in her possession. Add to that, there had not been a full autopsy done, so the defense used that hole in the case to start questioning the cause of death. Without looking at Mirna's brain, how could they rule out something like a stroke? The truth was they couldn't. And the defense attacked the cause of death as being cyanide poisoning. 70 minutes after Mirna's death, no cyanide was detected in her stomach fluid, but then 3 days later on autopsy, it was 0.2 milligrams, which is below a lethal dose. It's the amount that's in about 10 apple seeds. Meanwhile, the prosecution said the coffee cup had 7,400 milligrams of cyanide in it, which the defense expert testified would have caused symptoms in others who were around the cup. It was enough to start giving off fumes, yet Hani tasted a little, and the manager took a sip, yet neither had symptoms, and the barista smelled the coffee and had no ill effects. Now, the prosecution did point out that Jessica sat there looking dazed before her friend showed up, so it was possible maybe she inhaled some of it, but then why didn't anyone else get sick? The defense also pointed out some odd things that came up in the investigation. For one thing, the cafe could not produce the footage of the police removing the coffee from the scene, yet they had every shot of Jessica from that day. The police had poured the coffee into a different bottle but could not produce the chain of evidence indicating when they did it or the details about it that would prove that no contamination happened. And then the defense had an expert testify that he saw Mirna's body 2 hours after death and her face was blue, which is also indicated in photos that had been provided. When someone dies of cyanide poison, they don't turn blue. Their skin actually looks cherry red. The way this works is that while cyanide prevents your body from using oxygen, it doesn't stop the body from taking it in. So rather than a lack of oxygen, which causes cyanosis, which is the blue tinge to the skin or lips, the body actually has too much oxygen that it can't use. That leads instead to a red color to the skin. After this testimony, Mirna's father printed out photos and put them on the desk of the prosecutor and the table for the judges. In these photos, Mirna's face did look ruddy rather than blue. However, the defense expert insinuated that the photos had been doctored, which then caused a ruckus in the courtroom. The defense then had another expert, a pathologist from Australia, who testified that there were no signs of cyanide poisoning and that Mirna's death was likely natural causes. He, however, did not get to complete his testimony because the prosecution found out that he had been paid to be there, but he didn't enter the country on the right visa for that. So they literally had him deported immediately, and he was not allowed to re-enter the country for 6 months, which would be after the trial was over. Now, between this testimony about the sparkle in Julia Roberts' eyes to the deportation of a defense expert, this trial was sensational. And on the day-to-day proceedings, it was no less so, as there was a rather chaotic atmosphere in the courtroom. People applauded, cheered, and called out during the trial. Public opinion, which had been wildly against Jessica at the start of the trial, had started leveling out, so there were two sides in the audience shouting and making noise. You can see scenes of it in the documentary Ice Cold, and it's an interesting thing to see because the accepted behavior in a courtroom is completely different than it is in the US, and I always find it fascinating to get a glimpse into other legal systems. The defense thought that through this entire trial that they had a good chance at getting a not guilty verdict based on the prosecution's evidence, or rather lack of evidence. But then when the judges' rulings went against them again and again, and then their expert was deported, they began to feel like the judges were just biased against them. Jessica did testify on her own behalf at the end of the trial, which is, from my understanding, typical in Indonesia. The defendant has a right against self-incrimination, and their testimony is not offered under oath, so it's mostly just an opportunity for them to speak and say what they want to say and answer a few questions. Jessica testified sometimes calmly and sometimes while crying, and she denied killing Mirna. She said they were just chatting when Mirna took a sip of her coffee. She said it tasted awful, and without much warning, she collapsed. Jessica said it happened so fast, she really couldn't give many details. When asked some specifics like where she put her shopping bags and where the waiter put the drinks, Jessica simply could not remember. She also said that the interview she did with the psychologist that was used against her in this case was more like an interrogation, so she was not surprised she didn't come across well. She asked the panel of judges to look at the hard evidence, or again, like I said before, the lack of hard evidence, and decide based on that rather than speculation over what she could have been doing while sitting with the coffee in front of her. After months of testimony and court appearances, the panel of judges took the case and delivered their verdict on October 27, 2016. The verdict, which was read in full to the court, was 377 pages, and it took 4 hours to read. The too long didn't read version of this is that they found Jessica Wongso guilty of premeditated murder. Though the judges pointed out some issues with the prosecution's case, they accepted the motive that Jessica was jealous of Mirna and angry that Mirna had called out her toxic relationship with Patrick. They said they believed that the crime was premeditated based on how long Jessica sat at that table with the coffee before Mirna even showed up. She planned it, and she had 45 minutes to back out of it, but she didn't. Jessica told the judges that she did not accept their verdict as it was unfair and she called it biased. Her attorney echoed that and said this was a death knell for justice and there was an intent to appeal. Jessica was then sentenced to 20 years in prison. In the documentary that is on Netflix, which is called Ice Cold, Murder, Coffee, and Jessica Wongso, Jessica's attorney said that he believed she was framed, but he didn't have the evidence needed to prove it. The documentary does give a few possible scenarios, like possibly someone thought she was guilty and bribed the police to manufacture the evidence to prove it. Or maybe the case had just blown up so much in the media from the time of Mirna's death until Jessica's arrest that the case had to go forward to save face. Jessica was briefly interviewed for the documentary, but the authorities cut off the interview early when she started talking about the media coverage on her case, and they said the interview went too far. They then restricted access to her, which is very uncommon in Indonesia to not allow a prisoner to be interviewed by the media. Jessica did manage to get her diary out of the prison, and she wrote about the day of the coffee and explained some of the circumstances. For one, she said she ordered the drinks early because she thought her friends would be getting there earlier, more like 4:30, not after 5. She said she only moved her shopping bags around because she was bored sitting there waiting for her friends. This was just her fidgeting, nothing more. She wrote that she didn't poison Mirna and that she had been wrongfully convicted. As of the recording of this podcast episode, all of Jessica's appeals have been denied. Jessica is 7 years into her sentence. After she serves about half of her sentence, which is 10 years, and assuming she has good conduct and takes place in programs like work programs and counseling, she will be eligible to move to a low-security prison that allows day release for work and approved activities. After she serves 2/3 of her sentence, so about 13 and a half years, she can then apply for full parole. Parole in Indonesia requires that the family and the community Jessica will be released to agree to accept her. And this is the tricky part that leads to a low percentage of parole applications being granted. Many communities and even some families are just not open to accepting any type of responsibility for a person coming out of prison. However, I think for Jessica, she will likely have more support than the average person. She maintains her innocence and still has the support of her family. And while the media was initially biased against her, she is not without supporters. And that's really where this documentary comes in. I have to say, I don't feel it was necessarily biased in her favor, but they do raise some very good points about the lack of direct evidence. The fact that there was no cyanide in Mirna's stomach 70 minutes after death was a huge issue for me, as was the lack of a complete autopsy. I also wonder why, if Jessica knew there was poison in the coffee, did she draw attention to it? They thought this was a medical emergency and likely would have thrown out the coffee if Jessica hadn't said anything. I do feel that the motive presented in court was stronger than the documentary gave it credit for when you take into account just how unstable Jessica's life had been leading up to that moment. That's not to say the documentary left out what happened in Australia. They did include it. I think it's more about maybe context or framing, or it's just that my opinion on the strength of the motive is just different than a lot of people's. It's not really an issue of right or wrong, it's an issue of an opinion. Regardless, I'm surprised that a motive of any strength was enough for 3 judges to overcome that first tox screen showing no signs of cyanide. I do hope everyone goes and watches the documentary and it helps give people who are interested in true crime more information on the system in Indonesia, which always helps us expand our views on criminal justice and what that means. I can tell you about this case, about the media frenzy, about the courtroom atmosphere all I want, but until you see it, you really don't understand it. So I definitely recommend, if you have Netflix and it's available in your region, go check out Ice Cold, Murder, Coffee, and Jessica Wongso, and let me know what you think. Thank you for listening. You can find Crimelines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crimelines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.